Okay, this is a walkthrough of the essay for AQA Philosophy A-level on the perception topic, how convincing is indirect realism? So this is one of the longer 25-mark essay questions, and I'm going to run through just an outline plan with some of the detail on the key points here. It won't cover everything on the syllabus, but will give enough for a clear and fairly sophisticated essay, although you'll have to think about which of the arguments you find most convincing here. So first of all, what are we looking to achieve? What do the examiners look for ultimately in the exam? Three things, very basically. They'll look for a clear argument or intent or thesis to start and throughout. So you need to know what you think here. How convincing do you find indirect realism? Or do you find an alternative theory such as direct realism more convincing? Secondly, they'll look for detail on the arguments and counter-arguments or replies. This could be premises and conclusions. It could be technical language that's used to outline the different positions. And thirdly, they'll look for clear evaluative judgments throughout. So you need to know how strong the arguments are and be able to articulate reasons for why they are strong or not so strong. Here is a quick overview of the syllabus. I won't go through all of this. You can see the key points that you might get asked short questions on here. As I said, I won't cover every single one of these points here. This is just going to be an overview, really focusing on what a good 25-mark essay should do. So just remember, you might see this language, what are the immediate objects of perception in the questions. It's asking you what are the things that are directly present to your mind when you are perceiving something. Are they, as the indirect realist thinks, mental objects, sense data, or are they, as the direct realist thinks, physical objects and their properties? So let's start with definitions then. What is indirect realism? Indirect realism is the theory that what we perceive in any act of perception is mind-dependent things, so sense data. And those sense data are caused by and represent the physical objects outside of the mind. So in the language of the syllabus, the immediate object of perception, the thing directly present to our minds when perceiving, is sense data, which is a private, non-physical and temporary representation of the world. It might be useful to think of these two claims as covering different areas of philosophy. The first claim is the indirect claim, which is an epistemological claim. It's about how we perceive the world. And the second claim is a metaphysical claim or ontological claim. It's about the thing which we actually perceive. So it's putting forward a theory which says there are non-physical things called sense data. So a good 25-mark question will ideally set out some sort of evaluative criteria to start off with. What is it that makes a convincing theory of perception? What should a good theory of perception do? Well, the philosopher William Fish talks about a couple of tests you can use for theories of perception. So you don't necessarily need the fancy words here, but I think the ideas behind them are useful. So a good theory of perception should properly explain how it feels or seems to have a perception of a certain kind. So if I'm hallucinating that there are pink elephants running around on the ceiling, a good theory of perception should explain how it feels or seems to me to have that experience. This is sometimes known as the phenomenological test, from phenomenology, which is the study of appearances. Secondly, a good theory of perception should explain how we gain knowledge from perception in a way that avoids skepticism. So it shouldn't lead us into a situation where we are cut off from knowledge of the world. So this is sometimes called the epistemological test. And then thirdly, the best theory should explain the issue without proposing unnecessary objects or assumptions. There's multiple ways that you can talk about this. So a good theory should not multiply entities beyond necessity, or of two equally explanatory theories, you should prefer the one with fewer assumptions. This is the principle of Occam's razor. So we can use these, you can use these to judge some of the arguments that we're going to look at in the body of this essay. Very rough idea of how to structure 25 markers. You want an introduction at the start which explains the question and states your view, clearly prioritizing reasons for it. So you want to set out the debate. So the question is asking about indirect realism. This is a debate between perhaps indirect realism and direct realism about the immediate object of perception. This essay will argue, or I will argue, indirect realism is convincing for X, Y, or Z reason. Try and set out what you think clearly to start off with. If you can, say how it can deal with the objections you're going to explain. The body of the essay wants to be a series of arguments, counter-arguments, and evaluative points. We've just gone over some of the ways in which you could evaluate some of this. So try and say, as you're going through, with mini conclusions after your exchanges of arguments and counter-arguments, whether the criticism or the argument is damaging and whether it survives the criticism and why. Repeat this structure as many times as you can. If you can write loads, there's lots to talk about in this essay, as we'll see. At the end, you want to wrap up, concluding, summing up your view and restating the strongest reason for it. Try to keep at least 45 minutes to an hour in the exam for your 25 mark questions. In standard time, try and hit about kind of 50 minutes to an hour on the 25 markers for the best results. This is a basic plan. You don't have to do it in this order. Pick the arguments you're most comfortable with, but make the focus on criticisms, replies, and evaluation. So you want an introduction, explaining sense data and realism, stating your argument. You could do, in my suggested plan here, the argument from illusion, the direct realist reply. Primary and secondary qualities might feature. Berkeley's attack on this you could explain. And then core criticisms of indirect realism are going to be that it leads to skepticism. And then you have a number of replies that you could pick from. Don't just describe lots of replies here. Try and explain which one is best and why. Maybe one or two would be fine here. And then Berkeley's criticism that mind-dependent sense data cannot resemble mind-independent objects. That's his likeness principle. And potentially the reply that sense data doesn't have to resemble physical objects but can represent them in a predictable way. We'll go through these in the slides that follow. And then you want to wrap up saying what it is that you think. So the first part would be the classic argument from illusion against direct realism, supporting indirect realism and the idea of sense data. And then we'll look at how a direct realist could reply. So you can think of this as a kind of exchange or a debate throughout this topic between indirect realists and direct realists over whether we need sense data to explain our perceptions. So the classic argument here is the argument from illusion against direct realism, against the idea that what we see is the physical world directly. And to take the old example, we can say when viewing a straight stick half submerged in water, I am directly aware of something with the property of crookedness. I am seeing something crooked, even though there's something straight in front of me. This is an example of something that indirect realists call the phenomenal principle. If I am perceptually aware of something with some property X, then something exists with the property X. If I am seeing something crooked, then something exists which is crooked. but no relevant physical thing is crooked in this situation. Therefore, in this situation, I must be directly aware of something non-physical, my private, temporary, non-physical sense data, which represents the world, but is different from what's actually in the external world. The indirect realist wants to say that we're seeing sense data not just some of the time, though, but all of the time. What supports this claim? Well, what they say is that what I'm directly aware of here seems exactly like my normal, non-illusory perceptions. It's subjectively indistinguishable from my normal perceptions. So if I'm seeing an illusion, I can't tell it's an illusion, then it must be just like my normal perceptions. If that's the case, then in all cases of perception, we're directly aware of the same sort of thing, non-physical sense data, rather than physical objects directly. Premise 4 is sometimes known as the common factor principle. What I'm aware of in cases of illusory perceptions is just like, has something completely in common with my normal perceptions, so I must always be perceiving the same sort of thing. So how would a direct realist respond to this argument? Well, one way they can do this is by saying that when perceiving a stick in the water, what I'm perceiving is something that appears crooked, whilst there is in fact nothing that is crooked. So they say we don't need to put forward a separate mental object, sense data, which is crooked. We can explain this by saying that the stick, the physical object, has the property of appearing bent in certain contexts, such as when half submerged in water. This is what they call a relational property, as it only exists in relation between the stick and the water. So you're still directly aware of the physical world itself. You're just seeing it in a slightly distorted way because of the relation between the objects of the stick and the water. This is where you might bring in Occam's razor in defense of direct realism. If you think this is a convincing argument, perhaps we don't need to put forward this extra entity of sense data. We can explain things more simply by talking about relational properties. A further argument that we could get into would be Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So Locke divides the features of physical objects in the external world into two kinds. There's the primary qualities, which are mind independent. They exist external to the mind. And secondary qualities, which depend on interacting with the mind. As he puts it, those are powers to produce certain sensations in the mind. And he will talk in this case about things like color, smell, and taste as the powers to produce sensations in our mind, which are the secondary qualities which depend on us interacting with the object, whereas the primary qualities are there, as it were, even if no one's around to perceive them. This is important because it enables us, according to Locke, to distinguish the fundamental and objective properties of objects from their mere subjective appearance to us. So this would support indirect realism because it shows that some properties only occur at the level of our mental interpretations, i.e. color is experienced, as it were, in my sense data. It's not intrinsic to or fundamental to the object. The color occurs in our minds. It's not a product purely of the world or the object outside of the mind. Now, the idealist philosopher Berkeley does not accept this distinction. There's a number of reasons that he gives. We'll just mention one, perhaps here for the purpose of a debate in a 25-mark question. And Berkeley says that the distinction between primary and secondary qualities does not work. And we can break it down in this way. He argues that Locke says that secondary properties are mind dependent as they change between perceivers. So objects can appear to have different colors and tastes and so on. Therefore, they're mind dependent. Primary qualities, however, are also subject to perceptual variation, says Berkeley. Objects can appear to have different sizes, shapes, speeds, and so on. He says that something that might be incredibly large to a flea might be very small to an elephant. So size changes between perceivers. So for Berkeley, primary qualities are also mind dependent. This is something that they have fundamentally in common with the secondary properties, so there's no real distinction between the two kinds. Now for Berkeley, as an idealist, this is going to show that all properties of objects depend on minds. But I think an indirect realist could reply here that Berkeley misunderstands the distinction. Locke argues that secondary qualities are powers in objects to produce sensations in our mind. They are causal powers in external objects, and only the sensation exists in the mind. Therefore, Berkeley is mistaken to assert that the variation in sense data means that both sets of qualities exist in the mind, because they are both causally produced by external objects. The mere fact of variation does not show that they exist only in the mind. So Berkeley has misunderstood the distinction here. On to what might be the major criticism of indirect realism, the problem of skepticism. As a realist theory, indirect realism believes that there exists a world outside of the mind which causes us to have the sense data that we have. But this brings that view into question. The criticism runs like this. If all I'm aware of is my sense data, then I can't know what the external world is really like, or even if there is an external world. This is because my sense data acts as a veil blocking me from the external world. It's not as if I can get outside of my sense data and see the external world as it really is. So this is the problem of skepticism, and may lead to the trap of solipsism, or the view that only I exist, my mind exists, as I can't establish knowledge of anything beyond my own private sense data. This would be a philosophical dead end. If we're trying to do a theory of knowledge in epistemology and we end up with the view that we can't know anything outside of our own minds, this would fundamentally seem to be a failed theory of knowledge. Going back to the evaluative criteria before, this would fail the epistemological test because it shuts us off from having knowledge of the world. There are a variety of replies you could make to this. I'm only going to look at one, which is Locke's reply about the involuntary nature of our perceptions. So Locke argued that our perceptions can't be controlled, they're involuntary. He distinguishes between imagination, which we can control. I can control the image in my head of the bass guitar that I'm thinking of, make it a different color, put more strings on it. I can manipulate and control that image, but perceptions I can't control. If my perceptions were created purely by my mind, I would be able to conjure up perceptions of anything at will, but I can't do that. So this suggests that there is a real object beyond my mind which is causing me to have these perceptions. I can't, for instance, just imagine myself being on a beautiful beach in Hawaii or Greece somewhere and then that occur. I can't do that because I cannot control my perceptions. I can imagine that and imagine that image, but I cannot make that real. Likewise, I can't imagine words onto the page without physically writing them down. These kinds of things show that we can't simply say that our sense data is from our own minds. It must be caused by something external. But if we wanted to press the skeptical point, we could perhaps reply that Locke has not demonstrated the external world exists with certainty. It could still be the case that my experiences are part of a dream or the deception of an evil demon. Locke argues, however, that we've got enough evidence to provide all the assurance we can want, and that while an extreme skeptic may not be convinced, our convictions about the world remain secure enough to deserve to be called knowledge. So if you think that we do need sense data to explain our perceptions, and particularly of things like illusions, perhaps you could be on Locke's side here. Perhaps you could evaluate this and say that Locke is correct. But if you think that illusions and so on can be explained without sense data, and you want to take the direct realist side, you could say this is a fatal criticism, and the direct realist does not face the problem of skepticism because we're immediately aware of the physical objects in the external world. Moving on to the final syllabus criticism of Berkeley, of indirect realism rather. This is from Berkeley, where he's saying that we can't know the nature of mind-independent objects because mind-dependent ideas cannot be like mind-independent objects. This is a bit of a mouthful. What does this mean? He's saying that sense data cannot be like the external world. He argues that sense data cannot resemble the external world of material objects, particularly in their primary qualities, as Locke argues, because you cannot say that one thing resembles another unless you can compare them. But it's impossible to compare sense data to material objects because we can only ever access sense data, or in Berkeley's term, ideas. It's impossible, says Berkeley, to step outside of our minds to see the external object because we only ever perceive objects in our minds. He makes this point that it would be like saying something visible resembles something invisible. It's impossible and nonsensical. So for Berkeley, in this way, ideas or sense data can only ever be like other ideas or sense data. This is what he calls the likeness principle in idealism. Your ideas, your sense data can only be compared to other ideas or sense data. They cannot be compared to something that you never experience. If we want to defend Locke here, though, he could reply that sense data may not literally resemble the object, but could be said to represent the primary qualities in a regular and predictable way. For example, turning a coin in my hand might translate into a series of curved or oval sense data caused by the real nature of the coin. The object does not change into a different shape each time or vary in random ways from one day to the next. Therefore, it must have certain real and objective properties to be so regular and predictable. So again, if you want to defend the idea of sense data on the basis that it has the most explanatory power, perhaps, in explaining how our perceptions feel or seem to us, you could perhaps take Locke's side, or if you want to be a direct realist, you could say, well, they don't even face this problem. There is no sense data, so there is no problem of linking our sense data to external objects. A final point. This isn't on the syllabus, but worth mentioning. There is an objection that sense data is incoherent. You can look up this objection on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where they have an entry on sense data and a section on coherence objections. So what is the objection? By definition, we're supposed to be aware of all of the properties of our sense data. They're transparent to us. But if we see a spotted leopard, we're not aware of how many spots it has. So the objects, sense data, that are supposed to help explain how we perceive reality turn out to have aspects we cannot perceive. So the notion of sense data on this definition doesn't actually make sense. It's incoherent. In reply, the defender of sense data, Howard Robinson, points out that it's not correct to say that because we're unable to state all the facts about sense data's intrinsic structure when perceiving it, that it's incoherent. We need to distinguish between something being determinate or having properties that we can pin down at a qualitative level. I see a leopard with some spots, but indeterminate at a judgmental level. While I see the spotted leopard, I've not made a judgment on how many spots it has. Okay, we've looked at a number of objections and replies to indirect realism. Just a quick overview to wrap up of what the examiners will look for. When you write your practice essays, check your answers. Right at the start, is it absolutely clear what the question means, what the key terms are, and what you're going to argue? This is the crucial thing. Have you given your answer with a key reason why? Ideally, prioritizing between the reasons that you're going to talk about. Secondly, are you demonstrating detailed and precise understanding throughout? So the conclusion needs to be clear, the arguments in support of it stated precisely, integrated or linked coherently, and robustly defended, with arguments and counter-arguments stated in their strongest forms. So have you explained the arguments clearly in detail, with premises and conclusion where appropriate? Have you given replies to objections? Finally, and most importantly perhaps, have you made reasoned judgments about the strength of the points you've given? So in the examiner's language, the reasoned judgments are made on an ongoing basis and overall about the weight to be given to each argument. Crucial arguments are clearly identified against less crucial ones. So make sure that you've said why one argument or criticism is stronger than another, rather than just saying it is or asserting that it is. It needs to be clear what is the best argument and for what reason. So try and use, in this context, the arguments about phenomenology. This explains how it feels or seems to have a certain perception, or the arguments about skepticism. It leads us down a path towards skepticism shutting us off from knowledge of the world. You can also use, remember, Occam's razor. If you think sense data is unnecessary, say so and try and explain how the direct realist can account for these phenomena in different terms. Okay, I hope that's useful. I'll wrap up there.